Family and friends are worried when a young father goes missing right before Christmas.
He could have been anywhere.
This is not like him.
That's not like him not to text.
Christmas had come and gone, and nobody had heard from him.
The search feels endless.
They posted on social media and organized a search.
Me and my sister and everybody was looking for him.
She believes that there's foul play involved.
Or had he disappeared by choice?
In the past, he's bounced from house to house.
She might have even thought he left town.
Until their worst fears are confirmed.
I could see his foot sticking out, and I knew.
His body was by the creek for 2 weeks.
As the investigation unfolds, secrets surface.
There's domestic violence and infidelity.
I should have just stayed away from him, baby.
It really just leads down a rabbit hole of trying to find the truth about what happened.
But the truth always comes to light.
The witness was terrified. Violent.
She says she knows what happened.
She dropped a bomb on us.
December 22nd, 2021. It's 3 days before Christmas in Columbia, South Carolina, the Palmetto State's capital.
Columbia is unique in that it's the second largest city in South Carolina, but it also has a really hometown feel. People choose to live here because it's really family oriented. During the holidays, with people coming in town to visit family, it's just a very busy and exciting time.
But while most of the city is focused on the holidays ahead, 29-year-old Taylor Wardlaw is calling Columbia police to report her boyfriend, Terrell Sims, missing.
Terrell Sims.
She had not talked to Terrell in 2 days.
Taylor said she hadn't seen Terrell since early Monday morning. He had gotten home late, but then turned right around and left again.
He said that he had to go to a friend's house to go get his phone charger.
She says that at first, she wasn't too worried.
He plays by his own rules, you know, but this is not like him.
For the most part, he would be back home within a day or so.
But this time is different.
He is not answering his phone. He's not responding to messages. It's not like him to just ignore her calls or go without seeing his kids.
He was a really dedicated father. He was excited about his children.
She's convinced that something is wrong.
"26-year-old Terrell Sims could always bring a smile to those around him.
Terrell was fun. He liked to make people laugh. He always knew how to make you feel good.
He was considered the class clown.
His personality was infectious. He was someone that was always seen with a smile on his face.
But his life wasn't always easy.
He has a twin sister, and when they were infants, their mother passed away.
And then when they were 4, their father died.
As a result, Terrell and his sister were raised by their aunt, along with their other siblings.
She took all 4 of us in because she wanted to keep us together.
As a teenager, he fell in love and became a father.
They had a son when they were in high school.
He loved being a father.
While he loved his little boy, the relationship with the boy's mother didn't last.
It just wasn't meant to be.
So Terrell devoted more of his time to his first love, music.
Music was something that he loved to do.
He spent a lot of time listening to music, learning, and he seemed to be way ahead of his years with regards to his knowledge of music.
He used to rap, and I used to try to rap with him, and he said, "No, sis, that's not for you."
He dreamed of something bigger, something more. He believed rapping was his way out of his current circumstances.
Eventually, Terrell found his own place and continued to work hard on his dreams.
He moved into the colonies, a really large apartment complex here in the Columbia area, filled with young people who were trying to get their start.
He supported himself with fast food jobs and making sure that he can support his passion, which is his music.
While at the Colony Apartments, the aspiring rapper had no trouble attracting the ladies.
The women be like throwing themselves at him, calling him handsome.
That personality, coupled with his talent for music, really, really set him up to be a ladies' man.
And over the years, Terrell had 2 more children, both daughters.
He took very good care of his kids. Take them to the park, watch movies with them. He always made sure he got them gifts to give them money and things like that.
One of the reasons that Terrell was so excited about fatherhood is because he himself had been robbed of parents.
It made him want to be a better father.
But as great as his relationship was with his kids, he never remained in a committed relationship.
He had no interest in settling down with any one woman.
He loves all women. That's just was my brother's personality.
But that all changed when he met Taylor Wardlaw in 2018.
Terrell meets Taylor at the Colony apartment complex, and they instantly connect.
She was from the Bronx, so she had a different swagger to her. It excited him.
She's a single mom. She's all about family.
It wasn't long before they became an item.
She was happy and she was always laughing.
Taylor really turned things around for him. He felt like he had found the person that he wanted to spend the rest of his life with.
And before long, in 2020, they got the great news that they were going to welcome a new child together.
They were both bursting with excitement.
He was over the moon. He was looking forward to the fact that he was going to have another boy.
When their son arrived, the young family worked harder than ever to make ends meet.
They were committed to making their family work. She would work during the day, and then he would provide his support as dad and work at night.
And by 2021, they had saved up enough money to move into a modest rental home and out of the colonies.
They were headed in the right direction. Everything was looking up.
But now, just 3 days before Christmas, Terrell has gone missing.
I really think something is wrong.
We had our officer meet with her directly to take that missing persons report.
And when he gets there, Taylor says there may be a way to find him.
According to Taylor, he had just recently got out of jail.
And he is still wearing his court-ordered ankle monitor.
At the end of 2021, Terrell Sims and Taylor Wardlaw appeared well on their way to building a family and a future together.
He had 3 kids, she had 1 child, and together they made their family work.
They also shared a 1-year-old son together, and they had recently moved into a new house.
But now, after reporting Terrell missing, Taylor is meeting with an officer from the Columbia Police Department.
Taylor let him know that Terrell came home Monday and mentioned that he left his phone charger at his friend Jordan's house.
He left, and I haven't seen him since.
She says Terrell isn't answering his phone, and she doesn't know where he is.
That's not like him not to text or call.
Or is it just Taylor that he's giving the silent treatment?
She's afraid that he might have left her for someone else.
Taylor explains that while she loves Terrell, they had a very challenging relationship.
It was nothing major, just couple stuff. And the whole
But in the summer of 2020, things escalated.
Shortly before the birth of their son, Terrell was arrested on domestic violence charges.
He spent almost a year in jail, and he missed the birth of his son.
And the whole thing was just a big misunderstanding.
She kept saying he didn't do it. She tried to drop the charges, but the state wouldn't let her.
He was in jail for a year.
Taylor says she stayed in contact with Terrell while he was in jail and was happy to have him home after his release in August of 2021.
She's actually the one that went and bailed him out.
But when he came home, he was still wearing his court-ordered ankle monitor.
The purpose of that monitor is to really set up a zone where they are allowed to be and not allowed to be during their release time. The exclusion zone would have included Taylor's house.
He had to stay 1,000 feet away from her at all times. If not, his ankle monitor would alert the police and that he could face being rearrested.
But they had figured out a way around the exclusion zone.
She stated that they never had any issues because her and the kids moved into the rental property while he was in jail.
Taylor never told the court that she moved and had a new address. So once Terrell got out of jail, he moved back with Taylor.
He was with her the entire time, in complete violation of his parole and probation agreement upon his release.
According to Taylor, Terrell was just happy to be home with his family and get to know his new son.
She said things were really good between them.
But early Monday morning, she and Terrell had gotten into an argument.
Where have you been?
Chill out, man. I was just at Jordan's making beats.
No, you weren't.
She got on his case asking about who he's been with and where he's been.
She was very upset that he had been out for so long. But what really bothered her was that he left almost immediately after returning home.
Terrell stormed off, and when she asked him where he was going, he said he had left his charger at his friend's house and he was going to get it.
But now Terrell isn't answering her phone calls.
The reality is most people have more than one charger. So going back out in the early morning hours to get a charger just didn't make sense.
She thought he was lying, and she's afraid that he might have left her for someone else.
She says she's worried because he hasn't checked in on the kids.
But he's never done anything like this before.
After talking to Taylor, they put out a bolo on Terrell.
With the bolo out, the case is turned over to the detective, who tries to find out more about Terrell.
They pulled Terrell's police records, but they're mostly minor things.
He was kind of out in the streets when he was younger, and now that he's gotten older, he seemed like he was trying to kind of get it together.
But the arrest that landed him in jail is more serious.
The charge was stating that while Taylor was 9 months pregnant, Terrell had actually put a gun to her belly.
He threatened her and their unborn child.
Now, Terrell had denied doing this. It was a he said, she said situation. However, he was still arrested for this.
And unfortunately, with domestic violence, men are at a disadvantage when police are called. They're often seen as the aggressor. And when the cops showed up, despite both of them having conflicting reports, the police automatically believed her.
However, that's not all the detective finds inside Terrell's file.
According to police records, a few hours after Terrell went missing, his ankle monitor was removed.
The The detective investigating the disappearance of Terrell Sims has learned that he's no longer wearing the ankle monitor that tracks his movements.
He'd been ordered to wear the monitor as a condition of his bail for charges of domestic violence against Taylor.
Police are looking for whether or not people are tampering with these devices.
When the ankle monitor is tampered with, it sends out alerts letting them know that something is not right.
And early on December 20th, an alert on Terrell's ankle monitor came in.
Terrell Sims' ankle monitor had been cut off. Typically when somebody's absconding from supervision, that's because they don't want us to know where they are anymore.
According to the system, Terrell was about 10 minutes northwest of Columbia when the monitor went out.
It appeared to be on Monticello Road, which is a highway leading out of town.
Soon after, the monitor lost signal.
So investigators head out to Monticello Road.
We started the investigation where the ankle monitor was cut off.
It was in a very rural area, lots of streams, rocks.
They search the area, but there is no sign of Terrell.
But they do eventually find the monitor.
Hey, I got something.
With the ankle monitor a dead end, the detective turns to Terrell's friend, Jordan.
He was the friend that Terrell was with, supposedly the night that he disappeared.
Terrell had been hanging out with him on Sunday evening, and he went home sometime after midnight.
While there, Taylor had been texting Terrell all night.
Taylor was calling incessantly throughout the night. Multiple text messages. And it was clear that she was very angry.
Although Jordan had seen Terrell before, he did not come back to his house.
In fact, he knows nothing about Terrell leaving a phone charger.
So now the detectives are trying to find out, was that just a lie that he told Taylor while walking out the door?
I want to get my charger from Jordan's. Relax.
The officer will show you out.
Hoping for more insight, the detective reaches out to Terrell's sisters.
Terrell and his sisters were very close. They really relied on each other throughout their upbringing.
However, they did mention that ever since he got out of jail, something seemed different. He seemed a little troubled.
They said that Taylor portrayed this like happy little family on her social media, and they just felt like something was off with them.
He was very distant. He wasn't his normal, jovial self.
At Thanksgiving, he just kept drinking and drinking. It didn't seem like him.
What the family says seems to add credence to Taylor's fears that Terrell might have just walked out on her.
But even as the detective is suspecting that's the case, it appears that Taylor may have changed her mind.
Christmas had come and gone, and nobody had heard from him.
Taylor posted on social media about Terrell's disappearance and organized a search.
She seemed exasperated that she couldn't find him and didn't know what happened to him.
Taylor isn't the only one losing patience.
His two sisters hadn't heard from him.
I started wondering why they wasn't pursuing. And when I found out in the state of South Carolina, if your loved one don't have a mental illness, they're gonna give time for your loved one to come back.
But Terrell's sister suspects he isn't coming back.
She believes that there's foul play involved.
My brother's not gonna throw away his freedom, you know, he just got home and I don't see him cutting no ankle monitor up.
Because even if Terrell wanted to disappear out of Taylor's life, why would he not answer the phone calls of his sisters, his family, or his kids?
And then not only that, Terrell was always the type to let somebody know where he was at.
So where was Terrell? No one could figure out where this man was.
Me and my sister and everybody was looking for Terrell, trying to figure out where his last location was.
A possible answer comes late on the evening of December 28th, when a woman named Letitia walks into the police station.
How can I help you?
She says she knows what happened to Terrell.
And she knows who did it.
She killed him.
A woman named Letitia has come forward to the detective investigating Terrell Sims' disappearance, claiming she knows what happened to the 26-year-old aspiring rapper.
What's more is she claims to know who did it.
She dropped a bomb on us.
She explained that she's been friends with Taylor for a long time.
On the 20th, Letitia said Taylor came over with the man she refers to as Youngster.
I don't know his real name, but I'd seen him with her a few times before.
Taylor said she has something urgent to tell Letitia.
What's going on, girl?
You're not gonna believe what I've been through.
What's going on?
Taylor told her that Terrell had came home the night before, and they got into a huge argument.
Where have you been?
She thought he was cheating on her.
No, you weren't.
This did align with what Taylor told them.
But after that, the story starts to differ.
According to Letitia, Taylor said during the argument, Terrell hit her. And in response, she pulled out a gun and shot him 4 times.
I'm over you. I'm over your kids. I'm over everything.
I just wanted him to stop.
She was not going to be a victim anymore. She was simply protecting herself from further violence.
Is he?
Yes.
She said that once she killed Terrell, she called up Youngster and asked him to come over and help her get rid of the body.
Youngster, I need your help.
According to Letitia, Youngster agreed to come over and help Taylor load Terrell's body into the back of her rental car.
They proceeded to drive him out into the country onto Monticello Road.
That's when Youngster cut the ankle monitor off of Terrell's leg.
And then they kept driving, looking for a place to dump the body.
She told me that they took him to some kind of an overlook or a bridge.
Taylor told Letitia that they tossed the body over.
They were expecting to hear a splash because they thought they were throwing him into a stream.
But according to Letitia, that wasn't what happened.
Splash in the water.
I thought you said.
They didn't go down to check, and they just left him there.
She told me that's why they came.
Letitia says that is why they came to her apartment that day.
I didn't hear anything.
She wanted help moving his body because she didn't think she disposed of it properly.
She was blown away. Not only that Taylor had admitted this to her, but now she was at her house asking her to help her.
According to Letitia, she told Taylor no.
I'm sorry, but no.
She just didn't want anything to do with it.
Yes, she said.
And that's not all the information Letitia has for the detective.
According to what Taylor said, when she shot Terrell, one of the bullets missed. It went all the way through the wall of the house and hit the rental car outside.
And it hit the rental car.
It's such a wealth of detail about Terrell's disappearance that the detective is left wondering whether Letitia knows even more than she claims.
They really have no way of knowing whether or not Letitia is involved, if she is calculating this to clear her own name.
Following her interview, the detective starts checking with local car rental agencies.
They eventually found where Taylor had rented an SUV a week before Christmas, and she had recently returned it.
They're told that when it was returned, there was some body damage.
And where's that car now?
The rental company sent it to the body shop, apparently to repair a hole in the hood.
They located the vehicle, and lo and behold, there's a hole that Letitia described from a bullet in the hood of this vehicle.
The detective has the car towed to their lab, where they find more damning evidence.
They sprayed down the SUV's hatchback with luminol.
And what do you know? It glowed.
Detectives investigating the disappearance of Terrell Sims now believe they're investigating a homicide.
I have some information about Terrell.
First, the witness came forward claiming that Terrell's girlfriend, Taylor, confessed to killing him.
And now they found a bullet hole and blood in the rental car that had been in Taylor's possession on the evening Terrell disappeared.
But is the blood Terrell's?
Samples from the SUV are sent off to the crime lab for testing while they continue building their case.
Detectives attempt to identify Taylor's alleged accomplice, a man their informant only knew as Youngster.
I ended up confirming his identity through his social media being connected with Taylor's.
Youngster turns out to be 30-year-old Eddie Brown.
And as Letitia said, he lives in the Colony Apartments.
But that's not all that Eddie and Taylor's social media reveals.
It appears that Taylor and Eddie are more than friends.
As a reminder, Terrell spent almost a year in jail before Taylor bailed him out on those domestic violence charges.
And Taylor has a whole sexual relationship with Eddie.
Does that mean that Letitia has it right that Taylor killed Terrell and Eddie is actually the accomplice? Or if Eddie was hooking up with Taylor, is it possible that Eddie wanted Terrell out of the picture now that he's out?
Hoping to determine Eddie's role in the crime, the detective requests surveillance footage from the Colony Apartments.
They have an extensive camera system. And scrubbing through the videos, detectives find footage of Taylor's SUV.
They see Taylor driving into the colonies at 4:30 in the morning on the night that Terrell supposedly disappeared.
It catches Taylor exiting the SUV and headed towards Eddie's apartment.
A few minutes later, Taylor and Eddie leave the apartment and get back in the SUV.
She leaves with her boyfriend, Eddie Brown.
Everything about this footage is explosive. And it's not lost on the detectives that when they spoke to Taylor, at no time did she ever mention leaving her house.
And while the videos aren't perfect, the damage on the SUV's hood is clearly visible.
Then, some 4 hours later, the SUV arrives back at the Colony Apartments.
She drops him off like nothing ever happened.
But the detective has a pretty good idea of where they've been.
Terrell's ankle monitor had been dumped near Monticello Road. But they needed to confirm if Eddie and Taylor had been to that location.
Hoping to prove that was where they'd gone, the detective turns to the city's traffic cameras.
We actually saw Taylor driving her vehicle outbound Monticello Road.
The footage places Taylor there a little before 8 a.m.
Then within 20 minutes, she was driving back inbound, and that was after his ankle monitor got cut off.
Everything fits what Letitia told detectives.
Which means Terrell's body can't be far, but it will be difficult to locate.
Monticello Road is an excellent place to dump a body. It's sparsely populated and heavily wooded.
There's all kinds of little creeks and rivers. I mean, he could have been anywhere.
Luckily, the timestamps on the camera narrowed the search radius down.
Based on the speed the SUV was going and the window of time of when it passed and when it came back, detectives figured that Terrell's body is somewhere within a radius of about 10 minutes.
With that as their starting point, the search begins.
We were just checking every creek, every river, little dump spots.
They searched all day but had nothing to show for it.
There was a sense of frustration. There was a lot of trash, but no bodies.
But I wasn't gonna call it quits without finding him.
Then, about 7 hours into the search, the detective stops on the bridge that crosses Shaver Creek.
I checked the side that had more water, and there wasn't anything there. And so I walked across to the other side, and when I looked down, I saw what looked like a body laying there in a trash bag. I was like, there's no way.
But a closer look left no doubt.
I could see his sock on his foot sticking out, and I knew that I found him.
One of the detectives searching for Terrell Sims believes she has found his body in a creek north of Columbia, South Carolina.
The location and settings are almost a perfect match for what Terrell's girlfriend Taylor supposedly told her friend Letitia.
I found him.
When backup arrives, they're able to tentatively determine that the body is indeed Terrell.
His body was actually preserved pretty well.
It's him.
It was cold at that time of year, and he hadn't actually really been submerged in the water.
While the medical examiner's team removes the body for autopsy, the detective faces the grim task of notifying Terrell's family.
It was very heartbreaking. It was a lot going through my mind that day.
But there is some relief. This is like closure.
And it's the final piece of evidence investigators need to arrest Taylor.
They get the warrants together and they arrest Taylor.
When the detectives sit down with her, she continues to act as if Terrell is just missing.
Well, man, I hope when y'all find this man, he can't say nothing to me. I should have just stayed away from him, man.
When detectives let Taylor know that they found Terrell's body, she acts surprised.
That's why I'm here, because he's dead?
She wants them to believe that she had nothing to do with it.
But detectives inform her that they already got the whole story from Letitia.
I didn't confess to nobody. Bro, this is wicked. So I'm going to jail for something that I did not do.
No. You're going to jail for something you did do.
That's when she asks for an attorney.
So the conversation with Taylor comes to an abrupt stop.
But when the detectives bring in Eddie, he's more willing to talk.
He quickly decides, hey, I'm not going to go to jail for something I didn't commit.
Okay, look, I had nothing to do with this.
He begins confirming exactly Letitia's original story to the police.
Well, I wasn't even there when it happened.
He said that Terrell had assaulted Taylor and she shot him in self-defense. And he helped her clean it up and dispose of the body. But he minimized his role.
And so he was charged with accessory after the fact.
The news of Taylor's involvement hits Terrell's family hard.
It was very emotional. I was trying to keep it together for his kids and my sister.
But can investigators make the murder charges stick?
She described shooting him as being an act of self-defense.
Keep playing with me. You really want me to kill you?
Terrell is already out on bail for a prior domestic violence charge.
Which meant that there was a chance that Taylor could get off scot-free.
But once they conducted the autopsy of Terrell's body, it was clear that that was not the case.
He had been shot 5 or 6 times through his back. So he wasn't attacking her. He was trying to leave. And she couldn't handle that. This wasn't self-defense.
With this new information, it really questions the initial arrest that he had, where she says that he attempted to kill her and the baby, and he denied.
But it's Taylor's phone records that give police their best indication of Taylor's motive.
In the days leading up to Terrell's death, she had been texting him repeatedly, asking why he wasn't coming home, who he was with.
Taylor appeared consumed with jealousy, despite having another boyfriend.
And on the night of the murder, jealousy had boiled over into rage.
You could tell that she didn't feel like she was in control of the situation.
So when he finally did come home, detectives believed that Taylor was waiting, angry and ready.
Where were you?
While we don't know exactly what happened, it's apparent there was some sort of confrontation.
You are nuts. All right, stop.
And Taylor pulled out a gun and shot Terrell.
When she was faced with the possibility of him leaving, she made the decision that he would never leave again.
Even worse, Taylor shot Terrell while their children were in the house.
She just didn't care.
It didn't slow her down from her desire to control Terrell.
But would the jury agree? Prosecutors aren't sure.
Given Terrell's history, there just might be enough reasonable doubt to stand in the way of a conviction.
So in March 2024, they make a deal with Taylor.
She pleads guilty to voluntary manslaughter in exchange for a 20-year jail sentence.
I was upset. I mean, I ain't gonna lie. I wanted to fight her, but what would that solve?
I'm glad that it came to an end, but I wish that she was in prison for the rest of her life, because she's a really evil person. Not once did she ever apologize or express any remorse.
Eddie's role in disposing of Terrell's body earns him 11 years in prison.
I do not believe justice was served in this case. 20 years and 11 years is not good enough for what they did.
All she had to do is say, well, Terrell, this ain't working. We can't be together no more.
And now 4 kids are gonna be without their dad.
But if there's one thing the family and the authorities agree on, it's that Terrell didn't deserve what happened.
I'm not saying my brother was perfect, but still, how he left this world was wrong.
Here's Terrell, a young father, someone that just truly wanted a different life for himself and for his family, and his life is cut short.
If you see something ain't right in a relationship, or if somebody put their hands on you, don't stay, get out of it. You're worth more than that.
Abuse is never okay. If you or someone you love is in an abusive relationship, there is help available. Call the Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-SAFE.
Nearly half a century passed before anyone could say her name. For 48 years, she was not Ruth. She was not a daughter, not a sister, not a wife, not a mother, not a woman with a history, a photograph, a favorite song, or a place she once called home. She was a body in the sand, a mystery without an identity, a crime without a face. And in the summer of 1974, at the far edge of Cape Cod, where the Atlantic wind moved across the dunes and tourists came looking for sunlight, freedom, an illusion that nothing terrible could happen there, a young girl walking her dog stumbled upon something that would haunt Massachusetts for generations. It was July 26. The summer season was in full swing. Provincetown was alive. Cars moved along the roads. Visitors crowded the beaches. The ocean stretched toward the horizon, and beyond the ordinary noise of summer afternoon, inside the Cape Cod National Seashore, the dunes concealed a woman who had already been dead for weeks. She was found about a mile east of the Race Point Ranger Station. She had been brutally murdered, and whoever killed her had gone to extraordinary lengths to make sure no one would ever know who she was. The woman was approximately 37 years old. She had long reddish blonde or auburn hair. She had an athletic build. She stood roughly 5 feet 6.5 inches tall and weighed around 145 pounds. Her fingernails and toenails had been carefully maintained. Her teeth showed extensive dental work. Her hair had been tied back, and she was lying in the dunes on part of a light-colored beach blanket. But there was one detail that immediately transformed the case from a terrible homicide into something far darker. Her hands were missing. Investigators believed they had been deliberately removed. The implication was chilling. Someone had not simply wanted her dead. Someone may have wanted her to remain unidentified. Her head had also suffered devastating injuries. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma to the skull. She had been killed violently. Then she had been left alone among the dunes. No wallet. No reliable identification. No family waiting for a phone call. No name attached to the body. Only questions. Who was she? Where had she come from? Why had she been brought to Provincetown? Who had killed her? And why did someone care so much about making her anonymous? At first, investigators worked with what they had. The scene was examined. Dental records were considered. Missing person reports were reviewed. People were questioned. The woman was buried. But burial did not end the investigation. It only began a mystery that would survive almost 5 decades. She became known as the Lady of the Dunes. The name sounded almost poetic. The reality was anything but. She was a Jane Doe in a place famous for its beaches. A murder victim surrounded by tourists. A woman whose final resting place became more recognizable than the life she had lived. For years, investigators tried to reconstruct her identity from fragments. They studied her physical characteristics. They compared missing person reports. They created facial reconstructions. They produced drawings intended to show what she might have looked like at different ages. The technology changed. The investigators changed. The decades changed. but the woman remained nameless. In 1980, her remains were exhumed in another attempt to unlock the mystery. The case continued. In 2000, investigators tried again. In 2013, another exhumation followed. Each time, the hope was the same. Maybe science could finally tell them who she was. Maybe a missing person report from another state would suddenly connect. Maybe someone would recognize the face. Maybe a family would finally receive the phone call that had been delayed for decades. But the answer remained buried. The Lady of the Dunes became one of the most enduring cold cases in Massachusetts. And as the years passed, the mystery grew larger. People who had been children when she was found became parents. Parents became grandparents. Investigators retired. Witnesses died. Memories faded. Records disappeared. Technology that had not existed in 1974 became standard. DNA changed criminal investigations. Genetic databases expanded. And eventually, the case entered a new era. Because the woman who had once been impossible to identify now carried something more powerful than fingerprints. She carried DNA. For decades, investigators had known that DNA might one day provide the key. The problem was obtaining a usable profile. In 2021, a portion of her jaw was tested by Othram, a forensic genetics laboratory. A DNA profile was finally obtained. That changed everything. But DNA alone was not enough. The investigators still needed a path from an unknown genetic profile to a real person. That path came through investigative genealogy. It was a method that combined DNA analysis with traditional genealogical research and historical records. Instead of asking only, "Who is this person?" investigators could ask a different question. Who are this person's relatives? The search moved backward through family trees. Names began to emerge. Connections appeared. Branches of ancestry began pointing toward Tennessee. And somewhere inside those branches was a woman who had vanished from her family's life almost 50 years earlier. Her name was Ruth Marie Terry. Born in Tennessee in 1936, Ruth had lived an entire life before the Dunes ever knew her. She had family. She had relationships. She had a past. She had people who remembered her. And then, somehow, she disappeared. The woman known for almost half a century only as the Lady of the Dunes was finally given back her identity. Ruth Marie Terry. 37 years old at the time of her death. A daughter. A sister. A mother. A wife. A human being whose name had been waiting in records, photographs, memories, and family history, while her body remained unidentified in Massachusetts. On October 31st, 2022, authorities made the announcement. The FBI Boston Division, Massachusetts State Police, Provincetown Police, the Cape and Islands District Attorney's Office, and the U.S. Attorney's Office of the District of Massachusetts publicly confirmed what investigators had finally learned. The Lady of the Dunes had a name. Ruth Marie Terry. After 48 years, the gravestone could finally carry the truth. But identification was not the end. It was the beginning of a much more disturbing question. Who killed Ruth? Because finding her name did something investigators have been unable to do for nearly 5 decades. It gave them a door into her final months. And behind that door was a man. Guy Rockwell Moldovan, Ruth's husband. A man whose life had intersected with hers shortly before she vanished. Investigators learned that Ruth and Moldovan had married around 1973 or 1974. They also learned that the couple had traveled. Their movements became important. Their relationship became important. And then came a detail that transformed the investigation. After traveling, Moldovan returned. Ruth did not. He was reportedly driving what investigators believed was Ruth's vehicle. And witnesses recalled him saying that Ruth had died. For Ruth's family, the story had been different. They had been told there had been a fight during the honeymoon. Then silence. No Ruth. No explanation that made sense. No body. No confirmed death. For decades, the family had lived with uncertainty. Now investigators were reconstructing a chain of events that pointed back toward the husband. The mystery was no longer simply about a nameless woman in a Massachusetts dune. It was becoming the story of a woman who had disappeared after a relationship, traveled with a man, and ultimately turned up dead hundreds of miles from the place where her family remembered her. And then investigators discovered something else. Moldovan had a history that raised even more questions. In Seattle, in 1960, his previous wife and stepdaughter had died in circumstances that had attracted suspicion. He had been a suspect. He had never been charged with murder in those deaths. But the old allegations now existed beside the new investigation. The past was suddenly relevant. The name of a dead man was being pulled back into a homicide investigation decades after his own death. Moldovan died in 2002. He would never stand in a courtroom. He would never be interrogated about Ruth. He would never explain what happened in the dunes. He would never answer the question that had haunted investigators since 1974. And yet the evidence gathered after Ruth's identification led Massachusetts authorities to a conclusion. On August 28, 2023, the Cape and Islands District Attorney's Office announced that the investigation into Ruth Marie Terry's death had officially been closed. Investigators concluded that Guy Moldovan was responsible for her death. The case had reached a conclusion, but it was not the kind of conclusion that cold cases usually promise. There would be no trial, no dramatic courtroom confession, no jury listening to the final evidence, no defendant taking the witness stand. The man investigators determined was responsible had been dead for more than 2 decades. Justice, in the traditional sense, could not happen. But something else had happened. Ruth had been found. Not physically. She had been there all along. What investigators recovered was something different. They recovered her identity. They recovered the missing years. They recovered the connection between a woman from Tennessee and a body discovered in Massachusetts. They recovered a name that had disappeared from the public record. And in doing so, they transformed the Lady of the Dunes from an enduring mystery into Ruth Marie Terry. Yet the image of those dunes remains. Wind moving over sand. A blanket lying beneath a body. A woman whose hands have been taken away. A crime committed before modern DNA databases, before widespread genetic genealogy, before investigators could search millions of genetic connections from a single biological sample. In 1974, the killer may have believed the dunes would protect him. Perhaps he believed distance would protect him. Perhaps he believed the victim would become another forgotten Jane Doe. Perhaps he believed time would erase the crime. Time did not erase it. Time preserved it. Every decade added another layer. The original investigators left behind reports. The photographs remained. The dental records remained. The physical evidence remained. The skull remained. And eventually, science caught up with the past. A piece of bone that had waited for decades became the bridge between an unknown victim and a living family history. That is the strange cruelty of cold cases. The dead do not move. The evidence does not move. But the world around them does. Technology changes. Investigators learn new methods. Databases grow. Old assumptions are questioned. And sometimes, after decades of silence, a case that seemed permanently frozen begins to move again. For Ruth Marie Terry, that movement began with DNA, then genealogy, then family connections, then investigators following the trail, and finally a name, Ruth Marie Terry. It is difficult to understand what 48 years means until you consider what can happen in that amount of time. A child can be born and reach adulthood. A house can be demolished and replaced. A road can change. A town can change. An entire generation can disappear. A murder suspect can die. A detective can retire. A witness can forget. And still, somewhere in a file, a photograph can remain. Somewhere in a laboratory, a DNA sample can wait. Somewhere in a family tree, a name can survive. Ruth's name survived. Her family survived. The investigation survived. And the question survived. Not forever, but long enough. The Lady of the Dunes had finally become Ruth Marie Terry. And for the first time since that summer day in 1974, the story was no longer beginning with a nameless corpse. It was beginning with a woman. That distinction matters, because cold cases can sometimes reduce people to evidence. Measurements, dental charts, DNA profiles, photographs, skulls, dates. But Ruth was more than all of them. She was someone who had once walked through a town, someone who had spoken to people, someone whose absence was noticed, someone whose family had wondered what happened to her, someone whose life did not begin with the dunes. And it did not end there either. The dunes were only where the world finally found her. The real tragedy was that the world had spent nearly half a century unable to say who it had found. Now it could. Ruth Marie Terry. The name that had been missing. The name that transformed the case. The name that turned a legend back into a person. But there is one final darkness that remains over the story. The killer is dead. The victim has been identified. The investigation has been officially closed. And yet no courtroom will ever reconstruct those final hours. No jury will ever hear Ruth's last conversation. No witness can take the stand and explain exactly what happened inside the relationship between Ruth and Moldovan. There is no final recording. No surviving confession. No moment when the killer looked into a camera and admitted what he had done. Only evidence. Only investigation. Only conclusions reached after decades of work. And that means the silence remains part of the story. The silence of the dunes. The silence of a missing woman. The silence of a husband who returned without her. The silence of a family that waited. The silence of a man who died before investigators could confront him. And the silence that lasted until science finally broke it. For nearly 50 years, people asked who the Lady of the Dunes was. Now the answer is known. But perhaps the most haunting question is not who she was. It is how long the world could forget her. On a summer day in 1974, a woman disappeared into the unknown. In 2022, she returned to the world by name. And in 2023, investigators closed the case, concluding that her husband, Guy Moldovan, was responsible for her death. The killer could not be prosecuted. The victim could not speak. But the evidence spoke for her. And after nearly half a century, one of Massachusetts' most enduring mysteries finally had a name. Not Lady. Not Jane Doe. Not unidentified woman. Ruth Marie Terry. A name carried through DNA. A name recovered through genealogy. A name restored to a family. A name placed beside a date. A name that had been missing for 48 years. And somewhere beyond the roads, beyond the tourists, beyond the noise of Provincetown, the dunes remain. The wind still moves across them. The sand still shifts. The Atlantic still rises and falls. The landscape has no memory. But people do. Investigators do. Families do. And now history does. The woman who was once found nameless in the dunes is no longer nameless. She was Ruth Marie Terry. And the case that began with a body in the sand ended, almost half a century later, with the one thing the killer had failed to destroy: her identity, her name, her story, and the truth that, no matter how long it takes, sometimes the dead are still waiting for someone to find their way home. But a name does not erase a mystery. It changes the mystery. For 48 years, investigators have been asking who the woman was. After 2022, that question disappeared. In its place came something far more personal. What happened to Ruth Marie Terry before the dunes became the last chapter of her life? The answer was hidden not in one dramatic discovery, but in fragments. A marriage, a journey, a family story, a man who returned without her, and a trail that stretched from Tennessee to Massachusetts. Ruth had not simply appeared on Cape Cod. She had arrived there through a chain of decisions made by people who could never have known how their movements would later be reconstructed by investigators. That is what makes old homicide cases so unsettling. At the time, ordinary actions looked meaningless. A car ride, a hotel room, a conversation, a trip, a goodbye, a person getting into a vehicle, a person failing to come home. No one knows which moment will eventually become evidence. No one knows which forgotten detail will become the key. And in Ruth's case, the crucial details were separated by decades. Investigators had to work backward. They had to reconstruct a woman whose life had already been partially erased by time. Her family remembered her. Records remembered her. But the official investigation had known her only as an unidentified victim. That distinction had enormous consequences. Without a name, investigators could not easily establish where Ruth had been immediately before her death. They could not confidently trace her movements. They could not interview relatives about her personality, relationships, fears, plans, or habits. They could not ask a family member whether a particular man had been part of her life. They could not place the victim inside a human story. All they had was the crime scene, the dunes, the injuries, the missing hands, the body, and the question. Then genetic genealogy changed the equation. The science did not magically produce a name. It produced connections. And connections produced possibilities. Possibilities became family trees. Family trees became people. People became histories. And eventually, one branch led investigators to Ruth. It was an extraordinary reversal. For decades, investigators have been trying to identify the victim by examining the evidence surrounding her death. Now, they were identifying a victim through the evidence embedded inside her biological inheritance. Her DNA was carrying a message across generations. It was saying, in effect, this woman belongs somewhere. She came from somewhere. Someone was related to her. Someone had lost her. And that someone had been waiting almost half a century without knowing exactly what had happened. When Ruth's identity was announced, the case instantly changed in the public imagination. The Lady of the Dunes was no longer an anonymous figure from a crime photograph. She became a woman with a face, a woman with a family, a woman with a life before the murder. That was perhaps the most important discovery of all, because there's a terrible psychological distance between hearing the words unidentified homicide victim and hearing a person's name. The first sounds like a case file. The second sounds like a human being. Ruth Marie Terry. 3 words. Enough to reopen a life. Enough to make people ask questions that had been impossible to ask before. Where had she lived? Who had she known? Why had she traveled? Why was she with Guy Moldavin? And what happened between the moment she left with him and the moment her body was discovered beneath the sand? investigators began examining Moldovan more closely. His name was not new. His history was not clean. And the more investigators learned, the more troubling the story became. Moldovan had previously been married. His former wife and stepdaughter had died in Seattle in 1960. The circumstances had attracted suspicion. He had been investigated. He had been considered a suspect. But suspicion is not conviction. No murder charge was brought against him in those deaths. The case remained unresolved. And then, more than a decade later, Ruth entered his life. The two married. And at some point, they traveled. The exact sequence of events became critical, because Moldovan eventually returned. Ruth did not. A husband could come home. A wife could vanish. And somewhere hundreds of miles away, an unidentified woman was lying dead. For decades, those facts existed separately. After Ruth was identified, they could finally be placed beside one another. The investigators had something they had never possessed before: context. And context can be devastating. It can transform a strange coincidence into a pattern. It can turn an old statement into evidence. It can make a forgotten name suddenly relevant. It can force investigators to reconsider assumptions that once seemed reasonable. The question became whether Moldovan's account of Ruth's disappearance could survive the evidence. There was another unsettling detail. According to investigators, Moldovan had told people that Ruth had died. That statement mattered, because Ruth had not simply vanished into thin air. Her remains had eventually been discovered in Massachusetts. Her husband had returned without her, and the story of her death was apparently known, at least in some form, before authorities had ever identified her body. That raises an uncomfortable question. What did Moldovan know? When did he know it? And why? Those questions could not be answered in courtroom. The man who might have answered them was already gone. But investigators could still reconstruct. They could compare dates. They could examine records. They could revisit old reports. They could study the relationships. They could look at the movement of people and vehicles. They could examine statements made decades earlier. And they could compare all of it against the physical evidence recovered from Ruth. The more pieces were assembled, the more investigators came to believe that the murder was not random. Ruth's death appeared connected to her personal circumstances. That made the crime even more disturbing, because random violence is terrifying, but violence inside a relationship carries a different kind of horror. The person closest to you may also be the person who knows how to make you disappear. The person who knows where you are going. The person who knows your routines. The person who can tell others where you are. The person who can make an absence sound temporary. And if the victim disappears far from home, distance could become an accomplice. For Ruth, Massachusetts was far from the family members who knew her, far from the people who could immediately recognize her, far from the records that might have connected her to the investigation. And the dunes offered another advantage: isolation. The Cape Cod landscape can appear beautiful in photographs. Open sand, tall grass, blue water, endless sky. But beauty can conceal distance. A place crowded with tourists can contain spaces where almost no one is watching. That contradiction is part of the Lady of the Dunes mystery. She was discovered in a region filled with people. Yet whoever killed her had managed to place her somewhere sufficiently isolated that she remained undiscovered for weeks. The killer had time. That fact matters. Time to transport her. Time to leave her. Time to disappear. And then came the most extraordinary part. The investigation did not solve the case quickly. It did not solve in a year, or 5, or 10, or 20. Decades passed. The identity remained unknown. Every year added distance between the investigators and the crime. But the case never completely disappeared. New detectives inherited it. Old files were reopened. Technology improved. Facial reconstruction techniques changed. DNA testing became possible. And investigators continue to preserve the evidence. That persistence matters because cold cases are often lost not because there is no evidence, but because the evidence is waiting for a technology that has not yet been invented. In 1974, genetic genealogy did not exist as an investigative tool. In 1980, it was still impossible. In 2000, the idea was becoming scientifically imaginable but operationally limited. By the 2020s, investigators could use genetic information in ways that detectives of the 1970s could never have imagined. The past had suddenly acquired a new language, DNA. And Ruth's case became a demonstration of what that language could reveal. Her identity was not discovered because someone suddenly remembered seeing her. It was not discovered because a surviving witness walked into a police station. It was not discovered because the killer confessed. It was discovered because science created a bridge between a dead woman and living relatives. That bridge crossed nearly 50 years. And once investigators reached the other side, the old evidence began to make sense. Ruth was no longer an isolated victim. She was part of a family. And Moldovan was no longer simply a name in an old investigative file. He was a person connected to the victim, a husband, a man whose movements after Ruth disappeared became deeply significant, a man who could no longer be questioned, and a man whom investigators ultimately identified as responsible for Ruth's death. But there was still one thing the investigation could never recover: Ruth's final moments. That remains hidden. No matter how advanced forensic science becomes, there are limits. DNA can identify. Genealogy can connect. Records can reconstruct. Witness statements can illuminate. But none of them can perfectly recreate the final minutes of a person's life when no witness remains. That is where the silence begins. Somewhere between Ruth's last known movements and the discovery of her body. Somewhere between a marriage and a murder. Somewhere between a journey and a grave. There is a missing sequence of time. And that missing sequence is the darkest part of the case. Because the identity of the victim can now be spoken with certainty. The investigators can name the man they believe killed her. But the exact story of what happened inside those final hours remains incomplete. That is the nature of cold cases. They do not always end with every question answered. Sometimes they end when enough evidence exists to establish the central truth. A woman was murdered. Her name was Ruth Marie Terry. And investigators concluded that Guy Moldovan was responsible. Everything beyond that is the territory of reconstruction. Theories. Evidence. Statements. Patterns. And silence. Yet perhaps that is why the case continued to haunt Massachusetts for so long. The Lady of the Dunes was never simply an unsolved murder. She became a symbol of what happens when a person can be physically found but socially erased. For 48 years, the world knew where Ruth died. It did not know who she was. Her body had a location. Her death had a date. Her injuries had been documented. But her identity was missing. Now that identity has been restored. And with it came the realization that the woman in the dunes had been waiting all those years for the same thing every missing person waits for: recognition. Not fame. Not headlines. Not legend. Recognition. Someone to look at the evidence and say, this is Ruth. This was her life. This was her family. This is what happened to her. The Lady of the Dunes is no longer an unidentified woman. But the dunes still hold the silence of that summer. And the silence is difficult to escape. Because once a mystery has lasted almost 50 years, solving it does not erase the years of uncertainty. It reveals them. Every birthday Ruth's family spent without knowing. Every holiday. Every unanswered question. Every time someone wondered whether she might still be alive. Every year when there was no grave to visit. No explanation. No certainty. The identification could not give those years back. It could only give them meaning. And perhaps that is the final tragedy. Ruth was not lost because nobody cared. She was lost because the evidence could not speak loudly enough. Until one day it could. And when it finally spoke, it said her name. Ruth Marie Terry. The Lady of the Dunes had a name. But the sand had kept her secret for almost half a century. And even after the truth emerged, one question remained hanging over Cape Cod like the last sound after a door closes. How can anyone have believed that the dunes would keep a secret forever? Because they did not. The wind moved. The sand shifted. The decades passed. But the evidence remained, waiting. And eventually, someone came looking for it. The evidence had waited. That may be the most remarkable fact in the entire case. Not the headlines. Not the years. Not even the eventual identification. The evidence waited. It waited through changing police departments, through retiring detectives, through new generations of investigators, through the rise of computers, forensic databases, digital records, and technologies that would have seemed impossible when Ruth Marie Terry was found in 1974. And while the world changed around it, the central question remained fixed. Who was the woman in the dunes? For decades, the answer was nothing more than an approximation. A woman in her 30s. Auburn hair. Athletic build. Distinctive dental work. A body discovered in an isolated area of Cape Cod. That was all. But every unidentified victim carries a hidden history. A name exists somewhere. A childhood photograph may exist in an old album. A school record may exist in a dusty archive. A relative may remember a laugh. Someone may remember the way she walked into a room. Someone may remember the clothes she wore. Someone may remember the last time they saw her. The problem is that investigators do not always know where to look. For Ruth, the search was complicated by geography. She had died in Massachusetts. Her family connections led elsewhere, and the woman investigators were trying to identify had already crossed state lines before her death. The farther a person travels, the more difficult a missing person investigation can become. Different police departments, different jurisdictions, different records, different assumptions. A missing woman in one state may become an unidentified homicide victim in another. And when those two investigations never connect, the truth can disappear into the gap between them. That gap lasted nearly 50 years. Then technology began closing it. The modern investigation was fundamentally different from the investigation of 1974. Detectives could now work with biological evidence in ways their predecessors could not. They could extract DNA. They could build profiles. They could search for genetic relatives. They could reconstruct family relationships. And they could use those relationships as investigative leads. The science was powerful, but the human work remained difficult. A genetic match does not simply announce a victim's name. It creates a puzzle. Investigators must determine how people are related. They must build family trees. They must distinguish between close relatives and distant relatives. They must examine birth records, marriage records, census information, obituaries, and other historical documents. Then they must narrow thousands of possibilities. It is painstaking. It is slow. And it requires investigators to think like detectives and genealogists at the same time. For Ruth, That process eventually produced a breakthrough that earlier generations could not achieve. Her DNA pointed toward relatives. Those relatives pointed toward a family. And that family pointed toward a woman whose disappearance had never been properly connected to the body found on Cape Cod, Ruth Marie Terry. Suddenly, the unidentified victim had a history. And history creates context. Investigators could finally begin asking questions that had been impossible for decades. What was Ruth doing before she vanished? Who was she traveling with? What relationships shaped her final months? Why was she in Massachusetts? And most importantly, what happened between Ruth and Guy Moldovan? The name Moldovan had existed in the case long before the public knew Ruth's name. But the relationship between the two became far more significant after the identification. They had been married. They had traveled together. And then Ruth was gone. Moldovan returned without her. That fact alone did not prove murder. But investigators were no longer looking at a nameless woman and an unknown killer. They were examining the disappearance of a specific woman whose husband had been with her. The case had become personal. The timeline mattered. The statements mattered. The movements mattered. The history mattered. And the investigators began looking at the past with new eyes. That is another defining feature of cold cases. Evidence does not always change. Interpretation does. A report written in 1974 may have contained a detail that seemed insignificant at the time. Decades later, after a victim is identified, that same detail can become critical. A name that meant nothing becomes a connection. A location becomes a timeline. A statement becomes a contradiction. A relationship becomes a motive to investigate. The past can suddenly rearrange itself. And in Ruth's case, the old evidence was now being examined against a completely different background. The background of a known victim. The background of a known marriage. The background of a man with an earlier history that investigators could not ignore. Guy Moldovan had already been connected to another disturbing episode. In Seattle, in 1960, his former wife and stepdaughter died under circumstances that drew suspicion toward him. He was investigated. He was regarded as a suspect. But suspicion is not proof. No murder conviction followed. The earlier deaths remained a separate matter. Yet, when investigators eventually examined Ruth's case, that history could not simply be forgotten. It became part of the broader picture. A man who had previously attracted suspicion surrounding deaths in his family now appeared connected to another woman's disappearance and murder more than a decade later. The pattern was disturbing, but investigators still had to separate suspicion from evidence. That distinction is essential. A person's past does not automatically prove a later crime. A suspect can be investigated and never charged. A coincidence can look like a pattern. And a pattern can be misleading. But in a cold case, investigators do not have the luxury of ignoring anything potentially relevant. They follow the trail. They test the connections. They compare the records. They ask whether the pieces fit. And eventually, Massachusetts authorities reached a conclusion. They concluded that Moldovan was responsible for Ruth's death. But by then, he was beyond the reach of the courtroom. He had died in 2002. That created an unusual ending to a murder investigation. The man investigators believed responsible could not be arrested. He could not be interrogated. He could not be confronted with the evidence. He could not challenge the conclusions. He could not explain himself. And he could not tell Ruth's family what had happened. The investigation had to end without the traditional final act. No trial. No verdict. No sentence. Only an official conclusion. For some families, that kind of ending can feel incomplete. For others, identification itself is a form of justice. Because before Ruth was identified, her family did not have certainty. They had absence. They had unanswered questions. They had decades of not knowing. Now they had a grave, a name, a date, a place, and an explanation for the disappearance. It was painful, but uncertainty had finally been replaced by truth. That transformation is difficult to understand unless you consider what an unidentified victim represents. An unidentified person exists in a strange legal and emotional space. The authorities know that someone died, but they do not know who. The family may know that someone disappeared, but they do not know whether that person is dead. The two worlds remain separated. The body is here. The family is somewhere else. The police have evidence. The relatives have memories, but no bridge connects them. For Ruth, DNA became that bridge. A molecule carried the information that decades of conventional investigation could not recover. The irony is profound. Her killer may have believed that removing her hands would make identification more difficult, but he could not remove her genetic identity. He could not erase the biological relationships connecting her to generations of relatives. He could not erase the fact that every human being leaves traces of themselves behind. And he could not predict the future. That may be the greatest weakness of every unsolved crime. The perpetrator acts according to the technology and circumstances of the present, but the evidence remains available to the technology of the future. A killer in 1974 could not anticipate the investigative capabilities of 2022. He could not know what genetic genealogy would become. He could not know that forensic laboratories would eventually extract information from remains that had spent decades buried. He could not know that investigators would be able to search family connections across generations. He could not know that his victim would one day be identified. And he certainly could not know that the story would return to the headlines nearly 50 years later. The case became a reminder that time does not always destroy evidence. Sometimes it preserves it. Sometimes time is not the enemy. Sometimes time is the reason the truth is eventually discovered. The Lady of the Dunes had become part of American true crime history long before anyone knew her name. Her case appeared in newspapers. It was discussed by investigators. Her facial reconstructions circulated. Her story became part of the mythology of Cape Cod. People speculated about her identity. They imagined different possibilities. Some theories were plausible. Others were not. But every theory had one thing in common. They were all trying to give a name to a woman who had been denied one. That is why the eventual identification was so powerful. It did more than solve an administrative problem. It dismantled a legend. For almost half a century, the world knew her as the Lady of the Dunes, a mysterious figure, an unidentified murder victim, a woman whose final resting place became more famous than her life. Then the truth arrived. She was not a legend. She was Ruth, and the mystery had been hiding a human being. That realization changes the way the entire case is remembered. The dunes were not the beginning of Ruth's story. They were the end. Her story began somewhere else. In Tennessee, with a family, with ordinary experiences, with relationships and choices and plans. She had decades of life before the crime. The public simply did not know about them. And perhaps that is what made the case so haunting. The unidentified woman seemed almost to have appeared from nowhere. But people do not appear from nowhere. Every victim comes from somewhere. Every victim belongs to someone. Every disappearance creates a hole in a family. The difficulty is that investigators may not always know where that hole is. For Ruth's family, the hole had existed for years. Perhaps there had always been questions. Perhaps there had always been uncertainty. Perhaps there were moments when they hoped she would return. Then the announcement came. The Lady of the Dunes had a name. Ruth Marie Terry. A name that had been absent from the case for 48 years suddenly appeared everywhere. On news reports, in police statements, in historical records, on a gravestone, and in the memories of those who had known her. The woman who had been reduced to physical descriptions became a person again. Her identity had been restored. But the story did not become less disturbing. It became more disturbing, because now the victim had a face. Now investigators could see the human consequences of the crime. Now the question was no longer simply who had killed an unknown woman. It was who had killed Ruth. And that question leads directly back to the man investigators believed was responsible. Guy Moldovan. A husband. A traveler. A man who left Massachusetts alive after Ruth did not. A man whose earlier history had already attracted suspicion. A man who died years before the case could finally be resolved. The timing is cruel. The technology arrived too late for a courtroom, but it arrived in time for the truth. And perhaps that is a final distinction. Justice and truth are not always the same thing. Justice may require a trial, a verdict, a sentence. Truth requires evidence. The Lady of the Dunes case could not deliver every form of justice, but it delivered something the family had been denied for nearly half a century. Truth. Ruth Marie Terry was not forgotten. She had been unidentified. There is a difference. Forgotten means no one remembers. Unidentified means the world has not yet discovered the right answer. And somewhere inside that difference was a hope that kept the investigation alive. The evidence had not forgotten her. The detectives had not forgotten her. Her family had not forgotten her. And eventually, the world remembered her by name. Ruth Marie Terry. The woman in the dunes. The woman whose identity survived the killer's attempt to erase it. The woman whose story crossed nearly 50 years of American history before finally reaching the surface. And once the name was known, the silence of the dunes could never mean quite the same thing again. Because beneath the sand was not an anonymous mystery. There was a woman. There was a family. There was a life. And there was a truth that had been waiting all along. The truth had a name now. But names have a strange power. They can reopen doors that have been closed for decades. They can turn an old photograph into evidence. They can transform a missing person report into a homicide investigation. They can force investigators to look at the past again. And for Ruth Marie Terry, the past was suddenly everywhere. Every document became important. Every relationship became relevant. Every journey had to be reconsidered. Every person who had crossed her path became part of the reconstruction. The question was no longer simply where Ruth had been found. It was where she had been before she was found. That distinction sent investigators backward through time. The dunes were the final location. They were not the starting point. To understand the crime, investigators had to move away from the sand. Away from Cape Cod, away from the body, away from the famous image of the unidentified woman. They had to find Ruth before she became the Lady of the Dunes. That meant reconstructing a life that had been largely invisible to the public. A woman born in Tennessee. A woman who grew up. A woman who formed relationships. A woman who married. A woman who traveled. A woman who disappeared. And somewhere in that timeline was a moment when her life collided with the man investigators later identified as her killer, Guy Moldovan. His name had existed for years in connection with the investigation. But now investigators could place him inside Ruth's story. That changed everything. A husband is not simply another acquaintance. A husband has access. A husband knows routines. A husband can travel with a victim without immediately attracting suspicion. And if a wife disappears while traveling with her husband, There are questions that cannot easily be avoided. Where did they go? When did they separate? What did the husband tell people? When did he return? What did he bring back? And where was Ruth? The answers became pieces of the investigation. Some were recorded in official documents. Others survived through family memories. Others came from old interviews. Still others emerged only after modern investigators revisited information that had once seemed incomplete. This is how cold cases are often solved. Not with one piece of evidence, with accumulation. A detail here, a connection there, a contradiction, a confirmation, a DNA result, a genealogical branch, a historical record, a witness statement, and, eventually, enough pieces form a picture. But even when the picture becomes clear, the details around the edges can remain blurred. That is exactly what happened with Ruth. Investigators could establish who she was. They could establish how she died. They could identify the man they believed responsible. But the precise chronology of her final hours remained difficult to reconstruct. And perhaps that is what makes the case so haunting. There's a gap. A dark space between the last known moments of Ruth's life and the discovery of her body. No matter how many records are examined, that gap cannot be completely filled. The person who knew exactly what happened is dead. The woman who could have described the final moments is dead. And the landscape where the crime occurred has changed. The dunes have shifted. The roads have changed. The world has changed. But the unanswered questions remain. Was Ruth killed somewhere else and transported to the dunes? How long had she been there before she was discovered? Why were her hands removed? What did the killer believe would happen? Was the removal of her hands intended to prevent identification? Was it an attempt to destroy evidence? Was it part of a deliberate plan? Investigators could infer. They could examine forensic evidence. They could compare patterns. But some answers may never be known with absolute certainty. The brutality of the crime, however, was undeniable. Ruth had suffered severe injuries. She had been struck repeatedly in the head. Her death was violent. And after she was killed, her body was abandoned. That meant the killer had not only taken her life, he had taken away the possibility of an immediate identity. He had separated her body from her history. For decades, that separation held, until science broke it. The identification of Ruth was therefore more than a forensic breakthrough. It was a collapse of the wall between victim and family. For almost half a century, the family had one story. The police had another. The missing woman existed in one universe. The unidentified body existed in another. The two stories were never connected. Then, suddenly, they were. And once the connection was made, the emotional weight of the case changed. The woman in the dunes was no longer an abstract mystery. She had relatives. She had memories. She had a name that had once been spoken casually by people who knew her. That name had survived even when investigators could not find it. Ruth Marie Terry. It is easy to imagine the moment investigators realized they had the right person. After years of false leads, uncertain possibilities, and failed attempts, there must have been a moment when the pieces finally aligned. The unidentified woman from Massachusetts. The woman missing from Tennessee. The genetic relatives. The family tree. The historical records. The husband. The dates. The journey. The disappearance. The murder. The pieces began locking together. And suddenly, a woman who had been dead for nearly 50 years was no longer unknown. The discovery was announced publicly in October 2022. The news traveled rapidly. The Lady of the Dunes had finally been identified. For the public, it was a shocking revelation. For Ruth's family, it was something much deeper. It was the end of uncertainty. But it was also the beginning of grief, because identification can reopen pain. For decades, a family can survive by living with unanswered questions. There is no closure. But there is also no final confirmation. Hope can survive in uncertainty. When the truth arrives, hope must change shape. Ruth was not coming home. She had been dead since 1974. The family could not change that. They could only finally know. And knowing can hurt. But not knowing can last forever. That is why unidentified victims matter. Their identities are not merely labels. They are the connection between evidence and humanity. The name on a gravestone. The name spoken by relatives. The name that allows a person to exist in the historical record as something more than a case number. Ruth had been waiting for that connection. And eventually, she received it. But the investigation still had one final obstacle. The killer. Identifying Ruth did not automatically identify the person responsible. It only opened the door. Investigators had to walk through it. They examined Guy Moldovan's connection to Ruth. They revisited his history. They examined what he had said. They examined what others had reported. They considered his previous history. And they examined the circumstances surrounding Ruth's death. The earlier deaths associated with Moldovan in Seattle were particularly disturbing. His previous wife and stepdaughter had died in 1960. Moldovan had been investigated. He had been suspected. But no murder charge had followed. That old investigation could not simply be rewritten. The past remained legally unresolved. But for investigators examining Ruth's murder decades later, the history was significant. It raised questions. It provided context. It made Moldovan's relationship to Ruth impossible to view in isolation. Still, evidence had to carry the conclusion. And investigators ultimately concluded that Moldovan was responsible for Ruth's death. The announcement in 2023 effectively closed the case. But it also created an unusual historical record. The murderer had been identified after his death. The victim had been identified after her death. The case had been solved after both central figures were gone. There would be no confrontation, no confession, no trial, no dramatic courtroom ending. The story ended differently, with a conclusion written in an investigative file, with a name restored to a grave, with a family finally receiving answers, and with an old mystery finally losing its most important secret, the identity of the victim. But the case leaves behind a larger lesson about the nature of evidence. In 1974, investigators worked with what they had. They did not have the tools of the future. They could not use genetic genealogy. They could not search massive DNA databases. They could not reconstruct family connections through modern forensic methods. But they preserved evidence. That preservation mattered. Because science does not need to exist at the moment a crime occurs. Sometimes it only needs to exist later. That is why old evidence can become more valuable with time. The crime does not change. But the ability to understand the crime can change dramatically. A biological sample that seemed almost useless decades ago can become decisive. A photograph can be digitally enhanced. A database can reveal a connection. A genealogy researcher can discover a branch that an investigator could never have found manually. And suddenly, a case that seemed impossible begins moving. The Lady of the Dunes case demonstrates that principle with unusual clarity. For 48 years, the identity was beyond reach. Then, in a matter of months, decades of uncertainty began collapsing. The woman had a name. Her family had an answer. The investigation had a suspect. And the public finally knew that the mysterious woman buried beneath the Cape Cod sand had been Ruth Marie Terry. Yet there is another question that refuses to disappear. Why did it take so long? The answer is not simply that investigators failed. Cold cases are complicated. People move. Records disappear. Witnesses die. Memories fade. Technology has limits. And sometimes the most important evidence is not immediately recognizable as important. Investigators in 1974 could not know which discoveries would become possible decades later. They could only work with what was available. And they did. That effort created the foundation for the future investigation. Every report preserved, every sample collected, every photograph archived, every detail recorded. All of it became part of the chain. That chain eventually reached the modern era. And modern investigators pulled. They pulled until something moved. The identity. Then the family. Then the husband. Then the final conclusion. That is how Ruth's story returned. Not suddenly. Not magically. But piece by piece. And perhaps that is the most cinematic image of the entire case. Not the body in the dunes. Not the headlines. Not the police tape. But a laboratory sample sitting quietly for years, waiting for a scientist to understand what it could reveal. A microscopic trace carrying the answer to a question that had survived nearly half a century. Who was she? The answer was inside her. Ruth Marie Terry. The killer had taken her life. He had tried, investigators believe, to make identification difficult. But he could not erase her biological identity. He could not erase her family connections. He could not erase her past. And he could not stop future investigators from finding it. That is why the Lady of the Dunes story feels different now. For decades, it was a story about an unknown woman. Today, it is a story about a known woman whose identity survived an extraordinary attempt at erasure. The dunes still exist. The ocean still moves. Visitors still walk the beaches. People still travel to Cape Cod looking for beauty. Most will never think about what happened there in 1974. But beneath the landscape is a history that cannot be seen from a road. A history of violence. A history of uncertainty. A history of persistence. And a history of one woman whose name took 48 years to return. Ruth Marie Terry. The name changes everything. Because now, when the case is remembered, it is not only the Lady of the Dunes. It is Ruth. And Ruth had a life. The murder was one terrible moment in that life. It was not the entirety of it. The world may always remember the dunes. But her family remembered the woman. And that is perhaps the quietest form of justice left to her. To be remembered not only for how she died, but for the fact that she lived. The investigation may be closed. But history has a long memory. And every time the case is discussed, every time a name is spoken, every time a new generation learns how genetic genealogy identified an unknown victim, Ruth's identity moves farther away from anonymity. The Lady of the Dunes is no longer a question. She is an answer. Ruth Marie Terry. And somewhere in that answer is the final contradiction of the case. The killer succeeded in silence, but he failed in erasure. He killed Ruth. He concealed her identity. He left her in the dunes. He disappeared. He died. But the evidence remained, and nearly half a century later, it spoke. Not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly. Ruth Marie Terry. That was her name. That was the truth. And after 48 years of silence, the dunes could no longer keep it hidden. But even after a cold case is officially closed, the story does not necessarily end. Sometimes the closing of an investigation is only the moment when the public finally understands how much was lost. For Ruth Marie Terry, the most important discovery came almost half a century after her death. But identification could not restore the years. It could not return Ruth to the people who had been waiting for her. It could not undo the violence. It could not change the summer of 1974. And it could not answer every question that had gathered around her disappearance. That is the strange mathematics of time. 48 years can turn a murder investigation into history. But history does not make the victim less real. If anything, it makes the absence more visible. Think about the moment Ruth disappeared. There was no nationwide alarm. No modern missing person network instantly distributing her photograph. No social media. No searchable digital databases. No ability to upload a picture and reach millions of strangers within minutes. A woman could disappear across state lines and become almost invisible. And if the person responsible had enough distance, enough time, and enough control over the story, the disappearance could become something else entirely. A mystery, a rumor, an unanswered question, a file in a cabinet. That is what happened to Ruth. Her identity became separated from her body. Her family history became separated from the homicide. And the investigators who found her were left staring at a question with no obvious answer. Who was she? The absence of an identity also meant the absence of a motive. Investigators could not fully understand why someone would kill her because they did not yet know who she had been. They could not reconstruct her relationships. They could not identify enemies. They could not determine who might have feared her. They could not even confidently establish where she had been living immediately before her death. The investigation had a victim, but it did not have a life. That changed when Ruth's identity emerged. Suddenly, the case had a center. Ruth became the fixed point around which everything else could be organized. Her family, her marriage, her travels, her disappearance, her husband, the old reports, the old suspicions, the forensic evidence. All of it could now be connected. And once investigators connected those pieces, the name Guy Moldovan became impossible to ignore. Moldovan's relationship with Ruth was not a minor detail. He was her husband. He was one of the last people known to have been with her. And he returned without her. The timeline became increasingly disturbing. There was Ruth. There was Moldovan. There was a journey. Then there was the disappearance. Then there was a dead woman in Massachusetts. The distance between those events was where the mystery lived, and investigators had to cross it. The more they examined Moldovan's background, the more complicated the picture became. His previous wife and stepdaughter had died in Seattle in 1960. He had been suspected in connection with those deaths. Again, suspicion is not proof. No murder conviction resulted. But the old case existed. It had never vanished. And when Ruth's murder was reopened decades later, that earlier history became part of the investigation's context. Two separate periods. Two sets of deaths. One man. The similarities were disturbing enough to warrant examination. But investigators could not simply assume that one event proved another. They had to build the case around Ruth. That meant returning to the evidence. The physical evidence. The historical evidence. The witness accounts. The relationship. The movements. The statements. And the conclusions reached after the modern investigation. What emerges is not the story of one magical clue. It is the story of persistence. A case that survived because people refused to let the victim remain unidentified. That persistence began in 1974. When investigators arrived at the dunes, they had no idea that the woman would remain unidentified for decades. They could not have predicted the future. They could only document what was in front of them. A dead woman. A brutal crime. an isolated location, and the absence of a name. They recorded what they could. They examined her body. They studied her teeth. They documented her hair. They measured her height and weight. They preserved evidence. Those details became the foundation for everything that followed. The first investigators were working without the tools of modern forensic genealogy, but they were building the archive that future investigators would eventually use. That is the hidden continuity of cold cases. A detective from 1974 may never meet the detective working the case in 2022, but their work can still connect. One investigator collects evidence. Another preserves it. Another digitizes it. Another tests it. Another compares it. Another builds a genealogy. And suddenly, 5 decades of separate efforts become one investigation. That is what happened with Ruth. The technology changed. The question did not. Who was she? And eventually, the question was answered. Ruth Marie Terry. But the identification also revealed something else. The Lady of the Dunes had not been anonymous because she had no identity. She had been anonymous because the investigation had not yet found it. Her name existed. Her relatives existed. Her history existed. The information was simply disconnected. That distinction is important, because the mystery was never that Ruth had no past. The mystery was that no one could connect the past to the body. Genetic genealogy provided that connection. It took biological evidence from the unidentified remains and turned it into a family map. Then investigators followed the map. This process is sometimes described as a technological revolution in forensic investigation. But technology alone does not solve cases. People do. Scientists, detectives, genealogists, record specialists, analysts, and family members willing to answer questions about someone who disappeared decades earlier. Every discovery depends on someone asking the next question. Who is related to this DNA? Where does that relative fit in the family tree? Who could the unidentified person be? Which branch leads to Tennessee? Which woman disappeared? Who was she with? Where did she go? And why did she never return? The chain is fragile. One incorrect assumption can send investigators in the wrong direction. One missing record can stop a search. One family branch can remain hidden for years. But this time, the chain held. The evidence pointed toward Ruth, and Ruth pointed toward Moldovan. The final investigation concluded that Moldovan was responsible for her death. But because he had died in 2002, there would be no criminal prosecution. That fact creates an unusual emotional landscape. The case is solved. But there is no courtroom. There is a conclusion, but no verdict. There is accountability in the investigative record, but no sentence. For Ruth's family, that may have been difficult to accept. Yet there was something they had never possessed before: certainty. For decades, Ruth's absence could have meant many things. Maybe she had left. Maybe she had started another life. Maybe she had been killed. Maybe her body would never be found. Maybe the truth would never emerge. Every possibility carried its own pain. Then the worst possibility became the confirmed one. Ruth had died in 1974. She had been murdered. Her body had been found, and investigators had identified the man responsible. It was devastating. But it was no longer uncertain. There's a strange mercy in certainty. It hurts, but it stops the imagination from endlessly creating possibilities. A family can grieve a known death. An unknown disappearance can keep grief suspended for generations. Ruth's family finally had a place to direct that grief. They had a grave. They had a name. They had the truth. And they had the knowledge that investigators had not forgotten her. That matters because unidentified victims can easily become statistics. One body. One case number. One file. One cold case. But Ruth's story demonstrates why every unidentified victim deserves continued attention. Behind every Jane Doe is a real person. Behind every John Doe is a family. Behind every abandoned body is a story that existed before the crime. The label is temporary. The identity is permanent. And sometimes it takes decades to recover it. Ruth's case also demonstrates something darker. A killer can control the first chapter after murder. He can choose a location. He can attempt to destroy evidence. He can try to conceal identity. He can lie to people. He can cross state lines. He can wait for the news cycle to disappear. But he cannot control the future. He cannot control what technology becomes. He cannot control which investigator decides to reopen the file. He cannot control which scientist develops a new method. He cannot control which genealogist sees a connection. And he cannot control what happens after he dies. Moldovan died in 2002. The investigation continued. That fact alone is extraordinary. The suspect was gone. The victim remained unidentified. But the case remained alive. Then, 20 years after Moldovan's death, Ruth's name returned. The man who could no longer defend himself became the subject of a renewed investigation. The woman who could no longer speak finally had her identity restored. And the case that had survived generations finally reached its official conclusion. It is difficult to imagine a more dramatic reversal. For decades, the killer had a name. The victim did not. Eventually, that changed. Ruth had a name. The killer became a historical conclusion. The power shifted. The victim was no longer the unknown figure. She was the center of the story. That is how it should have been all along. Because the Lady of the Dunes was never really about the dunes. It was about Ruth. The sand was only the setting. The mystery was only the consequence. The murder was only the final event. Her life was larger. Her existence was larger. Her identity was larger. And now that identity is part of the historical record. Ruth Marie Terry. A woman born in Tennessee. A woman whose life carried her across state lines. A woman who married Guy Moldovan. A woman who disappeared. A woman who was murdered. A woman whose body was discovered on Cape Cod. A woman who remained unidentified for 48 years. And a woman whose name was finally recovered through modern forensic science. That sequence is almost impossible to believe. Yet it happened. And the case now stands as one of the most striking examples of how a decades-old mystery can be transformed by technology. The DNA did not change the past. It changed our ability to see it. The dunes did not reveal their secret. Science did. The killer did not confess. Evidence spoke. And Ruth did not return, but her identity did. That may be the closest thing to a final message in this case. A message carried through time. A message that survived the violence. A message that survived the concealment. A message that survived 48 years. Her name, Ruth Marie Terry. And once the world knew that name, the Lady of the Dunes could never again be just an unidentified body. She was a woman. She was someone's daughter, someone's relative, someone's wife, someone who had once lived an ordinary life before becoming the center of one of America's most enduring cold cases. The case is officially closed, but the memory remains. The dunes remain. The questions that cannot be answered remain, and perhaps they always will. Because even when science identifies a victim and investigators determine responsibility, there are parts of a murder that time can never recover. The exact words spoken, the exact sequence of movements, the precise moment when Ruth realized she was in danger, the final expression on her face, the final thought in her mind. Those details are gone. They belong to Ruth alone, and no investigation can bring them back. But one thing was recovered: her name. After nearly half a century, the unknown woman became known. The Lady of the Dunes became Ruth Marie Terry, and the case that once seemed destined to remain forever unsolved became a warning written across generations. A murder can be hidden. A body can be concealed. An identity can be erased from public view. But evidence has a memory. DNA has a memory. Families have a memory. And sometimes the truth simply waits for the world to become capable of hearing it. In Ruth's case, the world waited 48 years. Then it heard her name. The name had finally been recovered, but the investigation left behind another question that reaches beyond Ruth Marie Terry herself. What does it mean to solve a murder when almost everyone who stood at its center is gone? There is no suspect to bring into custody, no interrogation room, no attorney waiting outside, no prosecutor preparing witnesses, no jury, no sentence. There is only the evidence left behind by people who are no longer alive to explain it. That is where the Lady of the Dunes case enters a strange territory between criminal investigation and history. The crime happened in 1974. The identity was established in 2022. The official conclusion came in 2023. Almost 50 years separated the beginning from the end. A lifetime. And yet the case remained alive. That persistence is not accidental. Someone kept the file. Someone preserved the evidence. Someone kept asking questions. Someone believed the woman in the sand deserved a name. That belief is what carried the case across generations. In the early years, the investigation depended heavily on conventional methods: physical descriptions, dental records, missing person reports, witness interviews, public appeals. Investigators had to work from what could be seen and documented. The victim's body provided clues, but not enough to establish her identity. Her dental work was distinctive. Her physical characteristics were carefully recorded. Her hair was notable, but none of those details produced the answer. The case became a race against time, and time was winning. Every year that passed created another layer of difficulty. A missing person from 1974 might have been listed in a local newspaper that no longer circulated. A witness might have moved away. A relative might have died. A memory might have changed. A record might have been misplaced. The world of the investigation was slowly disappearing, and the woman at its center remained silent. The first major turning point came not from a new witness, but from the body itself. The remains were exhumed. Again and again, investigators returned to what was left. The decision to exhume a victim decades after burial is never routine. It means reopening a grave because investigators believe the past may contain something the present can finally understand. For Ruth, the remains became a continuing source of evidence. The body that had once failed to provide an identity eventually became the key to discovering one. That transformation is almost impossible to appreciate without understanding how dramatically forensic science changed. In 1974, investigators could document injuries. They could examine teeth. They could study physical characteristics. But modern DNA analysis was decades away. There was no consumer genealogy industry. There were no massive genetic databases accessible for investigative purposes. There was no established forensic genealogy workflow capable of turning an unknown homicide victim into a family tree. The science simply was not there. But the remains survived. And because they survived, future science had something to work with. That is why preservation matters. Evidence can outlive the technology available to interpret it. The investigators who preserved Ruth's remains could not know exactly how useful those remains would become. They only knew that an unidentified woman deserved to be remembered. Years later, that decision became critical. In the 21st century, forensic scientists began developing more sophisticated methods for extracting DNA from difficult samples. Modern laboratories could sometimes recover genetic information from skeletal remains that earlier testing methods could not use effectively. The science was no longer limited to asking whether a sample matched one specific person. It could ask whether the unknown individual was genetically related to someone. That was a revolutionary change. A traditional DNA investigation often starts with a suspect. Investigators obtain a reference sample. They compare it with crime scene evidence. If the profiles match, the connection can be powerful. But Ruth had no known suspect whose DNA could simply be compared. She had an unknown killer. So investigators needed another strategy. Instead of searching for the killer first, they searched for the victim. That meant looking for relatives. The logic was simple. If Ruth's DNA could be compared against a large enough network of genetic information, investigators might find people who shared ancestry with her. Those relatives could lead to a family tree, and the family tree could lead to Ruth. But the process itself is anything but simple. A distant genetic connection does not come with a name tag. It is a mathematical relationship, a possibility, a branch. Investigators and genealogists have to determine how that connection fits into a family structure. They may need to work through several generations. They may need to identify marriages, children, siblings, cousins, and descendants. They may need to account for incomplete records. And every step must be carefully verified. The goal is not to find a person who merely looks plausible. The goal is to build a chain strong enough to establish identity. For Ruth, that chain eventually became strong enough. Her DNA pointed toward relatives. Those relatives pointed toward a family. And the family pointed toward Ruth Marie Terry. The woman who had been unidentified since 1974 finally had an identity. But the announcement did something unexpected. It made the case feel new. For decades, people had known the Lady of the Dunes as a mystery. Suddenly, there was a face behind the mystery, a name behind the headline, a family behind the body, and a husband behind the disappearance. That last discovery was especially important, because once Ruth was identified, investigators could stop asking only who she was. They could ask what had happened to her. And the name Guy Moldovan emerged. The relationship between Ruth and Moldovan provided a possible explanation for how she came to be in Massachusetts. It also created a direct connection between a victim and a man who was no longer alive. Investigators examined his history. They looked at his relationship with Ruth. They examined statements associated with the disappearance. They reviewed the circumstances of his return without her. And they revisited an older chapter of his life. Seattle, 1960. A previous wife. A stepdaughter. Deaths that had generated suspicion. Moldovan had been investigated in connection with those deaths. But no murder conviction resulted. That distinction must remain clear. An old suspicion is not proof of a later homicide. Yet investigators examining a decades-old murder have to consider the full background of the people involved. The past can reveal behavior. It can reveal relationships. It can reveal inconsistencies. It can reveal patterns that deserve examination. And in Moldovan's case, investigators found enough information to conclude that he was responsible for Ruth's death. That conclusion was announced after the victim's identity had been established. It was a final major transformation of the case. For decades, there had been a victim without a name and a killer without a face. Then the victim received a name. And the investigation gave the killer a name as well. Guy Moldavin. But the man was already dead. He had died in 2002. That meant the case could never reach the traditional endpoint. No arrest. No trial. No verdict. No prison. The conclusion had to exist entirely within the investigative record. That may sound unsatisfying, but for cold case investigators, solving a homicide is not always synonymous with obtaining a conviction. Sometimes the central responsibility is to determine what happened and who was responsible. For Ruth, investigators reached that conclusion. And for her family, the importance of that conclusion cannot be measured by a courtroom. For decades, they had lived with question. What happened to Ruth? Now they had an answer. She had been murdered. She had been found in Massachusetts. And investigators concluded that her husband was responsible. The truth was terrible, but it was the truth. There is another element of the case that deserves attention. Ruth's hands. Their absence was one of the most disturbing features of the original investigation. The hands of a murder victim are often crucial sources of evidence. They can carry fingerprints. They can carry trace material. They can contain microscopic evidence. They can help establish identity. Removing them, therefore, had enormous implications. It suggested deliberate action. It suggested an attempt to complicate identification. And for decades, the absence of the hands became one of the most haunting details associated with the Lady of the Dunes. But the killer had underestimated something. Identity is not stored in one place. It is distributed. In teeth, in bones, in DNA, in family relationships, in historical records, in memories. A person cannot be completely erased simply by destroying one form of identification. The body itself carries a biological history. Ruth's genetic information remained, and that information eventually became more powerful than the missing hands. The killer may have attempted to make the victim anonymous. Instead, the crime created a mystery that attracted generations of investigators. Every failed identification added another reason to keep looking. Every year the case remained open became another reminder that the woman deserved an answer. The mystery grew, but so did the technology. That is the strange rhythm of cold cases. The investigator moves slowly. Science moves quickly. Then, sometimes, the two finally meet. For Ruth, that meeting came decades after her death. The evidence collected in the 20th century encountered technology developed in the 21st. And the past suddenly became readable. Her identity was no longer hidden. Her family was no longer separated from the victim. The case had a human face. But the public fascination with the Lady of the Dunes did not begin with the DNA breakthrough. It had existed for decades. The image of an unidentified woman discovered among the Cape Cod dunes had an almost mythological quality. The location was beautiful. The crime was brutal. The victim was anonymous. The combination was unforgettable. Over the years, the case became one of those mysteries that seemed almost impossible to solve. The longer it remained unresolved, the more legendary it became. People speculated. They created theories. They imagined possible identities. They tried to connect her to other disappearances. Some theories were reasonable. Others were based on little more than coincidence. But the fascination continued because one fundamental question remained unanswered. Who was she? The public had a nickname. The police had a case file. The grave had no real name. And the family of the woman who had disappeared had no certainty. Then, one day, the mystery broke open. Ruth Marie Terry. The announcement was not merely a forensic update. It was a correction of history. For almost half a century, the historical record had described an unidentified woman. Now the record could say who she was. And once the name was known, the case could finally be told in the proper order. Not beginning with a body, beginning with a life. Ruth existed before the dunes. She had a family before the headlines. She had relationships before the murder. She had hopes, fears, routines, and ordinary moments that no investigation could fully reconstruct. The crime became the most famous part of her story. But it was not the whole story. That distinction matters. Because when a person becomes famous through their death, the death can consume the identity. The Lady of the Dunes became an icon of an unsolved mystery. Ruth Marie Terry was a human being. The identification restored that humanity. It also restored responsibility. Someone did this to Ruth. Someone took her life. Someone left her in the dunes. Someone believed the mystery could last forever. But the mystery did not last forever. The truth was delayed. It was not destroyed. And that difference is the reason cold case investigators continue to return to old files. Because an unsolved case is not necessarily a case without an answer. Sometimes it is simply a case waiting for the right evidence. The Lady of the Dunes waited 48 years. Her remains waited. Her DNA waited. Her family history waited. And eventually, the right investigators arrived. They connected what previous generations could not. The woman in the sand became Ruth. The husband became the focus. The evidence became a conclusion. And the case moved from mystery into history. But history has a way of asking one final question. What would Ruth have wanted people to remember? Not the dunes. Not the missing hands. Not the headlines. Not the decades of speculation. Her name. Her existence. The fact that she lived. The fact that someone knew her before the world knew her as a murder victim. And perhaps that is the most important legacy of the case. After 48 years, the Lady of the Dunes was no longer a mystery waiting to be solved. She was Ruth Marie Terry. And that name, once lost, could finally be spoken again. The name Ruth Marie Terry had finally entered the official record, but names have consequences. Once a victim has a name, the people who knew her can be found. Once those people are found, memories can be recovered. And once memories are recovered, the final months of a victim's life can begin to emerge from the darkness. For almost 50 years, Ruth had existed in reverse. The world knew how she died before it knew how she lived. It knew the dunes before it knew Tennessee. It knew the murder before it knew the woman. It knew the injuries before it knew the person. Now investigators could finally reverse that order. They could begin with Ruth. And that meant looking beyond the crime scene, beyond the sand, beyond the body, beyond the photographs that had kept the mystery alive. The investigation had become a search through the architecture of a human life. Every marriage, every address, every journey, every relative, every document, every person who had once known her. All of it mattered, because the most important question was no longer simply who Ruth had been. It was what had happened to her during the period immediately before her death. That was where the investigation became darker. Ruth's connection to Guy Moldavin placed a living relationship at the center of the case. The woman who had once been impossible to identify now had a husband whose history could be examined. And investigators did exactly that. Moldavin was not an unknown figure. His name had appeared in an earlier investigation in Seattle. In 1960, his previous wife and stepdaughter had died under circumstances that attracted suspicion. Moldavin had been investigated. He had been considered a suspect. but there had been no murder conviction. That distinction remains critical. The earlier deaths did not prove Ruth's murder. They did not establish guilt. They did, however, provide investigators with historical context. When Ruth's case was finally reopened, the past had returned, and the investigators had to decide what was coincidence and what was meaningful. Cold case investigations are filled with that tension. A detective can find a dozen strange details. Only one may matter. A name may appear repeatedly. That does not necessarily make it significant. A timeline may look suspicious. That does not automatically make it proof. The task is to separate the noise from the signal. In Ruth's case, the signal became clearer as more evidence was assembled. She had been married to Moldavin. They had traveled. Then Ruth disappeared. Moldavin returned. And Ruth was eventually discovered dead in Massachusetts. Those facts could not be ignored. But the investigation needed more than suspicion. It needed a coherent explanation. And that explanation emerged through the accumulated evidence. One detail connected to another. One record reinforced another. One old statement took on new meaning after Ruth's identity became known. This is what makes the identification so important. Without Ruth's name, the investigation was forced to work outward from the body. After the identification, investigators could work inward from the life. The difference was enormous. Imagine having a murder victim but no biography. You know the victim's approximate age. You know the injuries. You know where the body was found. But you do not know her family. You do not know where she lived. You do not know who loved her. You do not know who feared her. You do not know who she trusted. You do not know who she might have been trying to escape. You do not know who might have wanted her dead. That is the nightmare of an unidentified homicide. The victim cannot tell you. The family cannot tell you. And the killer has every reason to remain silent. For Ruth, that silence lasted from 1974 until 2022. Then the door opened. The DNA pointed toward relatives. The relatives pointed toward a family. The family pointed toward Ruth. And Ruth pointed toward the people who had surrounded her life. That is how the case finally became understandable. Not simple. Not complete. But understandable. The identification also changed the meaning of the old facial reconstructions. For years, investigators had tried to create an image of the woman she might have been. Those reconstructions were attempts to give the public something recognizable. A face. A possibility. A person whom someone might know. But every reconstruction was built around uncertainty. The investigators did not know her name. They did not know her exact age. They did not know how she looked at different stages of her life. They could only estimate. Then Ruth's identity was established. The uncertainty surrounding the face disappeared. The reconstructed stranger became a real woman. The mystery face had a name. That transformation is one of the most powerful aspects of forensic identification. It is not simply about determining biological sex, age, or ancestry. It is about restoring individuality. A Jane Doe becomes a person. A body becomes a life. A case number becomes a name. And a grave can finally carry the truth. For Ruth, that truth had been delayed almost half a century. But the delay also revealed something about the power of persistence. The investigation did not disappear. Even when progress seemed impossible, the case remained. Even when technology failed, the evidence remained. Even when the decades passed, the woman remained unidentified. And that persistence eventually mattered. The modern investigation was able to take advantage of tools that did not exist when Ruth was murdered. Genetic genealogy became one of those tools. It changed the fundamental strategy. Instead of waiting for someone to recognize a victim, investigators could search through genetic relationships. Instead of asking only, "Who is this?" they could ask, "Who is related to this person?" That question opened an entirely different world. A distant cousin could become a lead. A family branch could become a map. A marriage record could become a bridge. A birth certificate could become confirmation. A genealogy could reveal a path that conventional police work had been unable to uncover. But even then, the process required caution. The wrong family tree could produce the wrong identity. A distant relationship could be misinterpreted. A missing record could create a false connection. Every conclusion had to be tested. And eventually, Ruth's identity survived that scrutiny. She was no longer merely a possibility. She was Ruth Marie Terry. The news of her identification was remarkable enough on its own. But the investigation did not stop there. The next challenge was to determine who had killed her. And this is where the case becomes especially unusual. Because the man investigators eventually identified as responsible had already been dead for years. Guy Moldavin died in 2002, 20 years before Ruth's identity was publicly announced. He could not be arrested. He could not be questioned. He could not respond to investigators. He could not provide his version of events. The investigation therefore became a reconstruction of a crime involving people who were all gone. That creates a difficult standard. Investigators must rely entirely on evidence that survived them. Documents, records, statements, forensic findings, historical information, and the physical remains. There is no suspect sitting in an interrogation room. No opportunity to catch a contradiction in real time. No chance to confront him with an unexpected piece of evidence. The truth must be built without him. And yet investigators reached a conclusion. They determined that Moldavin was responsible for Ruth's murder. That conclusion was announced in 2023. The official case was closed. But the closing statement did not erase the unanswered questions. If anything, it made those questions more visible. Why was Ruth killed? What exactly happened between her and Moldavin? Where did the murder occur? Why was her body left in the dunes? Why were her hands removed? What was the purpose of concealing her identity? Some of those questions may have plausible answers. Some may be supported by evidence. Others may never be answered. And this is where responsible retelling matters. A cold case can be dramatic without inventing facts. The truth is already disturbing enough. A woman disappeared. Her body was discovered in an isolated area. She remained unidentified for 48 years. Modern genetic genealogy finally revealed her identity. Investigators connected her to a husband who had died decades earlier, and authorities concluded that he was responsible for her death. That is the documented arc. Everything beyond it must be treated carefully, because the temptation in a mystery like this is to fill every silence, to imagine conversations, to invent motives, to describe the final minutes as though someone had been standing nearby. But no one knows those things with certainty. The silence belongs to the evidence, and the evidence has limits. That does not make the story less powerful. It makes it more haunting, because there are places where the investigation simply stops. There is no witness, no recording, no surviving confession, no final statement from Ruth. The last moments of her life remain inaccessible. And perhaps that is the one part of the case that time will never solve. Science can identify a person. It can connect relatives. It can reconstruct a family tree. It can help establish responsibility. But it cannot recreate consciousness. It cannot tell us what Ruth thought when she realized something was wrong. It cannot tell us what she saw. It cannot tell us what she wanted to say. That final silence is permanent, and it is precisely why the recovered identity matters so much. Because the one thing investigators could restore was the beginning. They could restore her name. They could restore the connection to her family. They could restore the fact that she had existed before the crime. The killer could not erase that. He could erase fingerprints. He could remove hands. He could abandon a body. He could create distance. But he could not erase a lifetime. He could not erase genetics. He could not erase family history. And he could not control the future. The future eventually came for the case. It arrived through forensic science. It arrived through investigators who refused to treat the case as ancient history. It arrived through technology that gave the dead a voice. And when that voice finally emerged, it did not accuse anyone. It simply identified the woman, Ruth Marie Terry. That was a breakthrough. The rest followed. The Lady of the Dunes had been anonymous for so long that the nickname almost became her identity. But nickname is not a name. A mystery is not a life. A crime scene is not a biography. Ruth had been more than the place where she died. She had been alive before the headlines. And now, after decades, the world could finally say so. That is why the story remains important. Not because it is one of America's strangest mysteries. Not because it lasted almost 50 years. Not because the victim was discovered in one of Cape Cod's most recognizable landscapes. But because the case demonstrates something fundamental. An unidentified victim is never truly without an identity. The identity exists somewhere. In DNA, in memory, in records, in family history, in a photograph stored in a box, in the recollection of someone who has not yet been asked the right question. The challenge is finding the bridge between those fragments. For Ruth, that bridge took decades to build. But it was built, and once it stood, the distance between the unknown and the known disappeared almost instantly. One moment, she was a Lady of the Dunes. The next, she was Ruth Marie Terry, a woman who had finally returned to history. And with that return came something else. A reminder to investigators everywhere that time does not necessarily mean defeat. A case can be old without being dead. Evidence can be decades old and still matter. A victim can remain unidentified for generations and still be found. And a killer can die believing the past is buried, only for the evidence to survive long enough to expose the truth. The sand had shifted for almost half a century. The world had changed, but the case remained, waiting. And when the right technology finally arrived, the mystery opened. The woman in the dunes was Ruth. The husband was Moldovan. The investigation reached its conclusion, and the silence that had surrounded the case for generations was finally broken, not by a confession, not by a dramatic arrest, but by a name, Ruth Marie Terry, a name that had waited nearly 50 years to return,